So another founding car, and today we will discuss chip tuning. So chip tuning is changing the fields of the engine management, and very often this is done for either more fuel economy, and that often comes with a limit on the performance. So for example the revs are limited within the range that they are very effective. And the other thing that is most known is that they chip tune, ECU tune for performance. So then for example you get 20% more horsepower and often also Newton meters. Some things to take into consideration, of course. Chip tuning can be done in different ways. Very often it is done by ECU tuning, so you then ride over the original fields with optimized, or at least optimized for performance fields. And why do manufacturers not start with all that performance if it's so easy to untap? Very often it is the manufacturer wants the car to have a lot of longevity and also can function with different types of fuel. So for example, if you're only able to get worse or bad quality fuel, the car can still manage that, because in the original fields there are some boundaries, reserves still present. Whereas if you chip tune your car, you're very often obliged to feed it with premium fuel, because you want to extract more performance, and then also you need good fuel to do that, because it is more at the optimized, the optimal range of the engine. So with the best fuel you could get that performance. Another example, if you look at the zc33s, I'm driving one, but if you look at the 1.4 turbo without hybrid, it's stated at 140 horsepower on 95 RON fuel, but if you feed it 98 RON fuel, it has about 155 horsepower stock. So also that standard ECU already makes do with the quality of the fuel and can compensate for those regions. Then there are also other ways to do this. For example, you could have more of a piggyback solution, so that you keep the normal ECU and then you attach that to an external device that has different parameters and fools the regular computer of the regular ECU, the stock ECU of the car, to think that it's running at less of its performance. So therefore it prompts the ECU that they can take more risks, so to say, and get better performance out of the car. The benefit of that is that it's more of a plug and play solution, easy done. And you can also remove it very often quite easily. The drawback is that it's only limited fields and it's not part of the ECU. Normally if you tune the car within the ECU itself, so real chip tuning, you get the best performance. The benefit of a piggyback solution is, however, the plug and play and the ease of use, and also that you can return it easily to the standard settings without reprogramming. And also when the car is reprogrammed, for example, it gets a software update, you still have the piggyback there, and the tune software is not overwritten then. Another thing to take into consideration if you want to do multiple things on your car, so for example exhaust, intake, then it's best to do the ECU tuning after you made those mods. And why is that? Then you can optimize for the setting that you're going to drive in, instead of a former setting, whereas for example you had more back pressure in your exhaust, so more restrictions, and also in the intake. So that's a point to take into consideration. And another point to take into consideration, some people will promise you the world they don't, how do you say it, back it up. So what I'm referring to, some people are chip tuning also without putting them on a rolling road resistance, so to dyno them. And once you have your car dynoed, you can still optimize and tweak it, and you look at all the parameters, and that's the best way to see if you are really getting those results. Another thing to consider is, especially with chip tuning, very often the transmission, the clutch, and sometimes also the gearbox or the axles are limited in the amount of power, especially Newton meters, so the torque they can handle. So very often, especially automatic systems are limited because they are limited in the torque they can handle, whereas manual transmission oftentimes are easier handling the torque. There are some performance type of cars that come with a very good double clutch PDK or DCT system that can manage perhaps even more in the automatic version than they can in the manual version. But take this into consideration, because perhaps the engine is able to cope with those additional forces, but perhaps the transmission or the clutch will be slipping. So what you can do then is you can just limit the maximum torque and still focus on the horsepower gains that you can get through ECU tuning. Also, when you have a car without a limited slip differential, especially if it's a front wheel drive car, there's a phenomenon called torque steer, even in standard stock cars, that they jutter for traction, especially in the corners. But with a limited slip differential, this is often very much taken care of, so that's a thing to take into consideration as well. Another thing to take into consideration is when you improve the performance of the car to the engine, it's also wise to improve the performance of the brakes and the suspension. So for example, lower it a little bit, that you have more traction. So when your car is more lowered and more stiff, very often it keeps more traction, because especially in a front wheel drive car, when you accelerate the nodes, it gets a tendency to lift off, to get a little bit floaty, transferring weight to the back. And when you're a front wheel drive car, of course, you want a lot of pressure on the nose, because there is the place that you're transferring the power to the road. But that's another point to take into consideration. So that being said, even if you have a tuner that promises you or shows you on a dyno that they can give you the best results, the highest horsepower gains, for example, and Newton meters gains, you also might want to look in what they are controlling. How good is that system? Are they really the best tuner for your specific brand or specific car? Because even if you have a car with less peak power, but for example a flatter torque curve, this could be better in all-day driving. And also you want someone that understands your car and doesn't overstress it. So that being said, then if you look at ECU tuning, what does it do? Normally it gives you a little bit advanced ignition. Sometimes also the maximum RPMs are upgraded, so to say, so that the car can rev higher. And sometimes also, especially in modern cars where they have multiple cars with the same engine, one is restricted and the other one is less restricted, they can de-restrict the restricted engines so they perform better. So in general, if you don't have a restricted engine and with NA, so normally aspirated, no turbo or supercharger, you get about 10% maximum with chip tuning. If you have a restricted car, for example, you have a car that comes with 150 horsepower and 180 horsepower, for example, some of the Mazda natural aspirated 2-liter derivatives, then the gains are of course a lot higher. And that could be a beneficial thing to consider. Some people say, I would not chip tune my naturally aspirated car because that is just a small percentage. But if you have a restricted natural aspirated or turbo car, of course the benefits are a lot higher. Another thing to consider is that once you have a turbo charged car, it's not only about the ignition, optimization, but also they can increase, for example, the turbo pressure. So the amount of air that is forced in, and when you have more air and more fuel and ignition, of course you get a lot more performance. So in general, turbocharged cars that are not restricted are very often in the range of 20% gains. So that's a good thing to take into consideration. When you have a restricted car that comes, for example, with 186 horsepower, but also with 250 or 260, yeah, then you get the de-restriction, and then in addition a tune, so you could be going from 180 to 280 horsepower, which is enormous gains. Another thing to consider is, of course, some cars don't gain that much, other cars do. For example, if you look at the Fiesta, a 1.5 liter 3-cylinder in ST form, it gets with a mount tune, which is a good tuner for Ford, from 200 in stock form to about 260 in tune form. If you look at this car, it comes with 129 horsepower in stock form, so the zc33s hybrid, 129 horsepower. If you look in practice, normally it's 135-ish horsepower. But if you tune it by a good tuner, for example BR Performance, you get up to 174 horsepower from a stock car. So those are quite good gains. It's only about 40 horsepower when you look at the actual gains, but about 45 when you look at the registered and marketed gains from the manufacturer. And that's a lot more if you look in the relation of the standard horsepower that you began with. So the Fiesta has almost double the standard horsepower, but only gets about 15 horsepower more than the advertised horsepower. So that gives you a little bit of insight. Foundering car, out.